Makes me want to holler. Chapter 16. Busted. After graduating from high school, Liz got a job as a sales clerk at Robert Hall Village, a new department store that opened near Cavalier Manor. When she'd been working there a while and gotten to know some of the other employees, we worked out a scam with several black cashiers in the store. After we got it down, I walked into the department store like a regular customer, got a shopping cart, and went on a spree. Through the men's section to get things I wanted, into the ladies' department to pick up a few items for Liz, and then on to appliances. When I finished, my cart was filled to the brim. I pushed it to a counter where a black cashier promptly rang up the price of one item, a $3 pair of socks, placed all my merchandise in large shopping bags, and stapled them closed with an attached receipt. I paid the lady, then took my bags to the front of the store and walked past the jewelry section, where Liz stood behind the counter, watching nervously as I approached. Our eyes met briefly, then turned away, as if we were two total strangers. I walked toward the front door, past the security guard, who glanced at my sealed bags and then turned his attention to something else. Once outside, I broke into a grin. We were over, like a fat rat. I think Liz enjoyed that ripoff because it was risky and exciting and made her feel like she was learning how to hustle. That hustle worked so well that we took Christmas orders from people in the neighborhood for jewelry, clothes, appliances, anything they wanted. We made a killing. In fact, Liz and I, along with some of the other employees who were also robbing the store blind, got over so well that the place eventually went out of business. By cleaning out the store and forcing it to close, we took away jobs that employed people in our community, and we got rid of a business that brought revenue to the area. We didn't view it that way at the time, but we did ourselves in. Once the place closed, Liz had to find another gig, and I looked around for another hustle to get into. After all my other hustles fell through, I went back to what I knew best. There were several stick-up teams operating from the neighborhood. I hooked up with Nutbrain and Charlie Gregg, two old heads who I figured knew everything there was to know about working the streets. Nutbrain and Charlie Gregg, who were both 3 years older than me, were longtime swinging partners who had hooked up when they were both living in the projects downtown. They were as thick as thieves. They were thieves. I had supreme faith in their experience and skills as stick-up men. Nutbrain, who used to school us about sex when we were kids, was tall, slim, and jet black. He was good with his hands and cool as ice, and nothing rattled him. Nutbrain, who lived about 4 blocks from me, didn't hang out on the corner much. He walked past our block, doing his slow old man pimp, looking like he had somewhere important to go. He always kept a brown bag tucked under his arm. Occasionally, he'd stop on the block, chat with the fellas and me, pull a pint bottle from the bag, take a swig, and talk some more. Although his nickname suggested otherwise, Nutbrain was smart in his own way. He didn't work often, but when he did, he specialized in on-the-job injuries. Every time I turned around, he was waiting on a check from some former employer who owed him compensation. He'd say, "Let me hold something till next week, man. I got some money coming in from a case I got when I hurt my back." I liked him a lot. He knew how to get over, and he was on the one. Charlie Gregg was married and had children. He worked a job, but needed money badly. I met him through Nutbrain. Charlie Gregg was brown-skinned, wiry like me, bow-legged, and cross-eyed as hell. He had bad feet that each looked like it wanted to take him in a different direction when he walked. Nutbrain jokingly called him Funky Winkerbean. Nutbrain was the mastermind of the team. He would case a joint perfectly and figure a plan, just like that. I also liked his style. Unlike Shell Shock, he had ethics. If you worked with him, you never had to worry about getting your cut. And he focused solely on businesses, which Shell Shock and I had avoided. I knew there was no real money to be made unless I crossed the tracks. I was right. We hit one spot and did good right away. Walked away with $1,000 apiece. It was a big step up from the chump change shell shocking I used to take from ghetto blacks. After that hit, I stayed up most of the night, counting the money over and over, marveling at what we'd done. It gave me a rush to know that I'd taken all of that money from white folks and gotten away clean. At the same time, there was this fear that had been nagging me for a while. It was the fear that the law of averages was closing in. This ripping off couldn't go on forever. Cats all around me were getting popped for one thing or another and being sent to the penitentiary, left and right. I figured that sooner or later I'd take a fall too. Sometimes when I thought about it, I didn't care. Sometimes I cared a whole lot more than I was willing to admit. Like the night Brain and I hit a supermarket on Military Highway. He scoped it beforehand and laid out the plan like a pro. We parked the car in a hotel parking lot nearby and walked across a large field to the store. Dressed in dark clothes, we entered the supermarket just before closing time. Brain told me, "Check the aisles and make sure all the customers are gone." I went up and down the aisles, stopping in one to pick up a Morton apple pie from the frozen food section. I went to the checkout area, where Brain was waiting. He pulled the gun and calmly ordered the cashier to empty the registers. It took a minute for other store clerks to figure out they were being robbed. I was jittery. The place was so large, I feared somebody might appear from behind an aisle and open fire. We got the cash, burst out the door, and began low running, hard across the lumpy field. All the while we're running, I'm thinking that this is going to be the one. This will be the time we get popped. I ran thinking it, feeling it. Remember how Charles Lee got surprised in that house and wondering if it might be in that way for me. I ran and listened, half expecting to hear a loud crack break the night silence and to feel the hot sting of a bullet pierce my back. I listened, but all I heard was heavy panic coming from Nutbrain and me, the two of us breathlessly trying to outrun fate. It's hard to move slow with fast money. Each time I went out on a job, I told myself it would be the last, and each time after that, I found the reason to go out one more time. That was the case with the Sheraton hit. We went out mainly because of Charlie Gregg, who was pissed because he missed out on the supermarket job. So Nutbrain came up with the Sheraton Hotel at the Military Circle shopping mall. He scoped it out and figured it would be an easy, big money hit. Fresh off the other job, I didn't really need the money. When Nutbrain called, I decided I'd use the funds to do something nice for Liz. Buy her a gift, an expensive looking dog, an Afghan hound. I got dressed that night in the black skull cap and dark clothes. I went to the living room and paced back and forth, waiting impatiently for Nutbrain and Charlie Gray to come and scoop me up. When my mother walked through the house and saw me standing there, peeping out the front curtain, she knew right away that something was up. She always got nervous when she saw me leaving the house. I was still on probation for shooting plaids, and she wanted to make sure I didn't take another fall. "Where you going?" she asked. I egged her like I usually did. I acted like I didn't even hear. "Don't go out there and get in no more trouble," she warned. "I ain't going to get in no trouble, Mama. I'm just going out for a while." A car horn sounded. Charlie Gregg and Nutbrain had pulled up out front. I was glad. It would have helped me escape another awkward scene with Mama. I left her standing at the open door, watching, straining to see whose car was out there and who was inside. I climbed into the back seat of Charlie Gregg's Dodge Charger and greeted the brothers. "Yo, brother man, what it is?" Nutbrain was his usual cool self. Charlie Gregg was pumped up. "Let's do it, baby. Let's make some money tonight." Riding down the interstate with music blaring from some 8-track tape, I sat quietly in the back seat and thought about what my mother had said. Normally, it wouldn't have bothered me, but that night it did. My intuition was burning again, It too was telling me I shouldn't go, but I was committed. We were on our way, speeding on Interstate 264 toward the Norfolk Tunnel. Nutbrain had figured that 10 p.m. was the best time to make the hit. We reached the Sheraton right on time, ready to make the quick walk into the door and take the few short steps to the registration desk where we were sure thousands of ducats were waiting for us in the cash register. But when we got inside, nothing was set up like we thought it would be. The hotel lobby, usually empty and unguarded, was crawling with white people dressed in tuxedos and gowns. There was some kind of special event going on. A policeman stood around watching, as if he half expected something to jump off. Nutbrain scanned the crowded room and said what Charlie Gregg and I were already thinking. "Let's go, man. There's no happenings here." I took that as another sign that this was a bad night, but Charlie Gregg was set on making a hit. We went to a convenience store, brought some wine, and drove around thinking and looking for a quick pedestrian Vic to roll. We drove onto Hampton Boulevard, and a light bulb came on in Nutbrain's head. "Yo, man, I know somewhere we can hit. Drive past that McDonald's down the street. Somebody comes in every night around 11 to pick up the money and take it to the bank. We can lay for him outside the door and take the shit from him when he comes out." It sounded simple enough. Still, I was uneasy. It wasn't the original plan. We didn't have time for the usual dry run of the getaway route, and the white neighborhood where we parked the car looked like a foreign land. I felt we should call it a night, but I didn't say anything. I couldn't punk out. When Charlie Gregg turned off the engine, Nutbrain turned around and handed me the gun. "Nate, it's your turn to carry the piece." He carried the gun and done most of the work the last time we went out. Despite the wine I guzzled to numb my fear, I was nervous. It just didn't feel right. As we entered the side door of the McDonald's, a beefy white man carrying a small, white, plastic pouch came out of the employee entrance. Now, my intuition told me he was the mark, but instead of drawing on him, I froze, then turned and ducked into the men's restroom nearby. Nutbrain and Charlie Gregg followed. Once inside, Brain said, "That's the man. He had the money in that pouch." The man had glanced warily at us, gone outside and climbed into a parked van. I said, "Maybe we should get him while he's in the truck." Nutbrain poked his head out the door and saw that the man had started the engine. "Nah, he's about to pull away. We're going to have to do the store." He said it like we had no other choice, like we couldn't just leave and try again some other time. Charlie Gregg nodded his approval, so I went along. After planning our move, we burst through a door that read "Employees Only." I flashed a silver-plated pistol and yelled. Nobody moved. The workers, stunned, turned and did what they were told. They left their cash registers, huddled in a corner, and stared wide-eyed at us. As shocked customers ran out the side exits, Nutbrain and Charlie Gregg hurriedly emptied loot from the cash registers into food carry-out bags with golden arches printed on the side. I stood guard near the door, pointing the gun and looking around. I didn't feel in control. There was too much light, too much space to cover, too many people in those ugly brown McDonald's uniforms looking right at our uncovered faces. Out the corner of my eye, I noticed the store manager trying to ease his way into a side office. I pointed the .32 pistol at him and said, "Freeze." Minutes later, he tried it again. I aimed the piece at his face, tightened my grip on the trigger, and tried to decide in that split second what to do. I swear I didn't want to blow him away. All I wanted was to get the cash and dash. But I made up in my mind that if he moved again, I had to smoke him. I hated him for putting that pressure on me. I didn't even know him, and I hated the hell out of him. Intuitively, I sensed he was an Uncle Tom, one of those head-scratching niggas willing to put his devalued life on the line to protect the white man's property. I looked him in the eye and warned, "Move again, and I'm going to bust your ass." He remained still and kept his eyes fixed on me. Once Nuts Brain and Charlie Brain had cleaned out the registers, we turned and ran out the side door and sprinted to the parked car a block away. We sped off into the night. 2 blocks down the dark street, we ran into a dead end. I knew then we were goners. Charlie Gregg wheeled around, sped out the cul-de-sac, and turned onto Hampton Boulevard. A few minutes later, he looked into his rearview mirror and said, "The rollers are behind me." Nutbrain told him, "Just be cool, maintain the speed." I sat in the back seat, tense, bracing for the bus. A police cruiser pulled closer and flashed its emergency lights. Then others came from nowhere and surrounded us. In the seconds while Charlie Gregg steered over to the curb and stopped, adrenaline rushed to my head. Panic thoughts came at me, rapid fire. Burst out and dash. No, shoot first, then run. Finally, I heeded my strongest intuition. Sit still, you're busted. After surrounding us, policemen sprang from their cruisers with their guns drawn, pulled open our doors and shouted, "Get out of the car, get out of the car." One cop grabbed me, pushed my chest flush against the side of the car, and clamped the cold steel handcuffs to my bony wrist. He shoved me into the back seat of a cruiser. The emergency lights flashed overhead created a weird, dreamlike effect. Cars slowed, and motorists peered through their windows, trying to get a better look. Some cops waved them on and directed traffic, while others flashed lights inside and around the getaway car. I stared blankly out the window and did something I had learned to do in years on the street when fear or reality became too much to face. I let my emotions go limp. That was my only protection against freaking out, my only guard against coming apart. The police drove us back to the McDonald's, where the employees stood outside. They escorted the manager to the car I was in and asked him if I was one of the men who had robbed the store. I glared into the manager's eyes, half open to intimidate him. He returned my glare with a dash of contempt. Yeah, he was the one with the gun. We drove off, beginning the long ride toward police headquarters. A ride in a police car always feels like a long journey to me. I always have time enough during such a ride to review my whole life. I rolled in the back seat, stared out the window, and let my mind wander aimlessly. I thought about crazy things. I thought about how much I hated being handcuffed, how much it pissed me off when cops locked the cuffs too tight around my wrists. I wonder why they had to cuff people's hands behind their backs like that. You can never sit straight up in the seat when you're handcuffed because your full weight comes down on you, squeezing your wrists painfully between your body and the back seat. Most guys I had ever seen riding in the back of police cars bobble from side to side, like bottles in water to keep from leaning back and crushing their hands. Over time, I learned to lean sideways and rest my head against the side window to keep my weight off my hands. Riding down Hampton Boulevard, I watched the world pass and thought about the people I saw walking, carefree along the sidewalks. Where are they going? What are their lives like? I wished I could change places with one of them. I wish I had listened to my mother. I wish I could rewind the last hour of my fucked up life and reset its course. I wish I was somewhere else, anywhere but riding in a cop car. My mind did a sweep of all the landmarks in my life, the kind of sweep described by people who have scrapes with death. It certainly felt like my life was over. I was 20, half burned out on drugs, depressed, and hopelessly lost. At some point in life, long before I ever held a gun, I had lost control. I tried to figure out what had gone wrong and when. I wished I could vanish, go back to a point in time when life seemed, well, hopeful. Strangely, I thought about my 3rd grade spelling bee. I was an honor student then and felt so full of promise. I had made it into the competition finals, but was eliminated after misspelling a word. I think it was bicycle. If I could go back to that night on that school stage, I thought, I would spell that word right and straighten out all the other things in life that had since gone wrong. My thoughts were distracted by the two white rollers sitting in front. They were laughing, joking about the stick-up and predicting how much penitentiary time we would get. I wanted to lash out. I wanted to tell them, kiss my black ass. But I kept quiet. We got to the police station along with the cars carrying Nutbrain and Charlie Gregg. When we got out, Nutbrain made the mistake of saying something to his police escort. Yo man, these handcuffs are too tight. The cop smiled broadly, stepped behind him, and yanked him tighter. Is that better? Nutbrain grimaced. They took us into separate rooms and started the process of interrogating us. Without talking with Nutbrain and Charlie Gregg, I knew what to do. Don't confess shit and don't give them any meaningful info until you talk with a lawyer. That's what everybody yells when they get busted. I want to talk to my lawyer. It just seems like something you should say to let them know they can't push you around. They took me into an office and sat me in a chair. Then they started the little cop head games that had become familiar to me. A few of them stood over me with their shirt sleeves rolled up, like they were going to do me in. A black detective did all the talking. When he asked me my name, I didn't answer at first. I considered giving them a hard time to show them that I wasn't scared, but it was late and I was too tired to play games. My name is Nathan McCall. Address, 6 Vaughn Court. The black cop sat on the edge of the desk in front of me and said, "Tell us what happened tonight." I said, "I didn't do nothing. I need to make a phone call." He looked at the others, indicating it was a waste of time trying to get me to talk. They laid off the crime questions and stuck to the basics. When the interrogations, fingerprinting, and processing ended a few hours later, we were thrown into the bullpen, a huge holding cell about 40 feet square, filled with 30 or so drunks, junkies, and assorted other losers. The place smelled like piss and vomit. Guys were leaning against the grimy walls looking tired and pitiful. It was about 2 a.m. The lights were dim. Everything was quiet. Nutbrain, Charlie Gregg, and I huddled near the bars and compared notes. Nutbrain was cool. Charlie Gregg, who seemed nervous, kept asking me questions. How did it go? It went all right. What did the rollers ask you? The same old dumb shit they always ask. Both of them had telephoned family members to say that they were locked up. I would have felt stupid calling my mother to say that I was in jail after doing exactly what she warned me not to do. No, I thought, I'm going to ride this one out on my own. But I called Liz at about 1:30 a.m. and told her the news. She freaked. What happened? What happened? I calmed her down and gave her instructions on how to find out when and where I'd be taken for a preliminary hearing later that day. After we got that straight, we hung up. I thought about how glad I'd be to see her face. Nutbrain, Charlie Gregg, and I talked some more, then decided to get some sleep. There was nowhere to lie down. The benches along the walls had been taken by the early arrivals. Some guys were trying to sleep standing up, like cows. They leaned on the walls, held their heads skyward, and closed their bloodshot eyes, like they were praying. Others were sprawled on the floor, sleeping hard. I staked out a spot on the floor and stretched out near the bars. The concrete was cold and smelly. I found a dingy half roll of toilet paper and slid it under my head to use as a pillow. Lying on my back, I stared at the greasy ceiling and thought about the mess I was in. Mama was right. I wouldn't be so lucky this time. I was penitentiary bound. In a weird way, that didn't seem so bad. I figured I might have been saved for something potentially worse. I had fully expected a more tragic fate, to be caught by surprise like Charles Lee the burglar, to go down in a shootout with the police like Prairie Dog. I knew that if I had come out of that car shooting, those trigger-happy cops would have blown me away. Later that morning, Charlie Gregg, Nutbrain, and I were shackled to some other inmates and led downstairs for a preliminary hearing. We looked like shit. Our hair was nappy. We hadn't brushed our teeth or washed our faces. I know I smelled like the pissy odor that rose from a yellow mist from the bullpen floor. As we stood before the judge, I glanced around the courtroom looking for Liz. I didn't see her. The judge asked us a few questions, then set bail for each of us at $25,000. I remember thinking, $25,000? I'll never get out of here. To get me out, my parents had to raise $2,500. Nutbrains and Charlie Gregg's people had to do the same. Less than 2 weeks after the stick-up, we all got out on bond, just in time for Christmas. The bus made the papers with a picture of the getaway car. My mother told me that a neighbor, seeing the photo in the paper, called the house to ask if the person identified in the photo caption was me. My parents didn't have the funds for a great lawyer this time. The best they could afford was some white poop butt dude. I could spot his kind a mile away. They get paid $1,000 or so to usher you up before the judge and try to make sure you don't get screwed too bad. They're great actors. They look and listen to your side of the story like they're really concerned. Then, after they've let you blow off steam, they start coaching you on how to throw yourself on the mercy of the court. Like Nutbrain and Charlie Gregg, I pleaded innocent during the preliminary hearing and asked for a jury trial. But my lawyer warned, you don't want to take a judge through a jury trial. We've got no defense. It'll only piss him off, and we don't want to piss off the judge. We canceled the jury request, but I kept my innocent plea. Weeks later, I gave in and changed my plea to guilty. After reviewing the case, my lawyer said that given the strength of the evidence against me, I'd come out with a lighter sentence if we did it that way. My guess, he said, is that you'll get some time, but it won't be much. Given my background and record, he predicted the judge would give me a 5-year sentence, at most. That meant I'd be eligible for parole after 15 months. I thought that maybe my lawyer had worked a deal, like the attorney I had when I shot Plaid. I figured I could do 15 months standing on my head. I needed at least that much time to dry out and clear my mind. On April 11th, 1975, the court date, I was accompanied to court by Reverend Ellis from Norfolk State, my parents, and Liz. As I moved to join my lawyer at the defense table, Reverend Ellis gave me a biblical verse to recite to myself. It was taken from the book of Romans, chapter 8, verse 28. I still remember it. Everything works together for the good of those who love God, for those who are called according to his purpose. It turned out to be a very short hearing. Witnesses were there who could recount the robbery if called upon. The McDonald's manager and a couple of employees were also there. The judge, an old white man, called out my name and launched into all that official jargon they use in court. Nathan McCall was brought before this Commonwealth of Virginia on the charge of armed robbery committed on December 4th, 1974. How shall you plead? At the prompting of my lawyer, I stood up, put my hands behind my back, and repeated my guilty plea. Without looking at me, the judge, sitting up high on his bench in the black robe, leafed through a file folder on his bench. Then he lifted his head and called me up front. Do you have anything to say for yourself before I announce sentencing? Something about the tone and the nature of that question let me know this was going to be a bad day. I scrambled in my head to try to come up with something that might sway that man. I sensed that if I didn't come up with a hell of a rap, he was going to lay some heavy time on me. But it was impossible to say all that was weighing on my heart. I felt choked up inside, as if all the emotions and words had converged on my throat at once and gotten bottled up. Standing there, looking solemn, I mumbled some bullshit about being sorry for committing the crime, then hated myself for even giving it that feeble, embarrassing try. After he was sure I'd finished, he said, "Anything else?" I shook my head and glanced at my lawyer, hoping he'd come in and help me out. The lawyer came up, stood beside me, and ran off a rap that was even weaker than mine. The judge nodded at the lawyer, then looked at me and said, "I sentence you to serve 12 years in prison." The words echoed in my head. 12 years. I felt faint, like the room was whirling about me. I heard screams in the back of the courtroom from my mother and Liz, but was too weak to look behind me with more than a fleeting glance. I looked at my lawyer, who stepped forward and pleaded with the judge. "Your Honor, please take into account the fact that this young man comes from a decent home and has never served prison time before." The judge was unmoved. "I'm sorry, but he has to learn that he can't go around putting guns to people's heads." He brought down his gavel. "The sentence stands." I stood there, stunned, the scene surreal. A bailiff walked up behind me and clamped handcuffs on my wrists. I glanced at my family in the rear of the courtroom. Their faces revealed their shock. A tearful Liz held her hands to her face in disbelief. My sobbing mother buried her face in my stepfather's chest, and Reverend Ellis stared blankly at the floor. When the bailiffs led me from the courtroom, I dropped my head to conceal my misty eyes.